industrial accidents, ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
I want to introduce pharmacist Edric Wong. Edric is a clinical pharmacist practicing in the emergency department at the University of Kansas Health System. He completed training as a critical care pharmacist, but fell to the allure of emergency medicine pharmacy practice and clinical toxicology.
So today, I would like to talk about mining, water, rice, and bone pain, cadmium poisoning in Toyama Prefecture, Japan. I have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose. And some objectives today, we're going to do a brief overview of cadmium, including the discovery, uses, and sources of cadmium. Then we will delve into the history behind Itai-Itai disease and how it happened. And lastly, we will do a quick review on some health-related risks and treatment of chronic cadmium poisoning. Cadmium was discovered by German chemist Friedrich Strohmeyer while testing the purity of zinc carbonate. He noticed while heating zinc carbonate that some of the product fluoresced yellow while some did not. He deduced that there was a trace of an element in the samples, which eventually led to the discovery of cadmium. Day to day, we see many hidden uses of cadmium that we don't often think about. Cadmium is used as a pigment and seen in different colors, including shades and hues of yellow, orange, and red. These colors are used in many products, including different ceramics, glassware, and plastics. If you take a look around you, you're likely very close to a product that was made with the assistance of cadmium. Cadmium occurs naturally at low concentrations in the environment and present alongside zinc ore, but could be concentrated by man-made operations. Mining and smelting ores, and in particular zinc ore, could release cadmium into water and soil, which could eventually end up in foods we eat and the water we drink. Cadmium dispersal into the air can occur by fossil fuel combustion, recycling electronic waste, and waste incineration. As previously mentioned, cadmium could end up in our food and water. In particular, plant uptake from soil contaminated with high cadmium concentrations and water would be a factor that led to Itai-Itai disease. In general, consumables have a relatively negligible cadmium load under normal circumstances where there are acceptable levels of cadmium in the soil and water. One thing to note here is that if animal offal is consumed, in particular the liver and kidneys, there may be 1 microgram of cadmium per gram of offal, higher than all the other products listed. There is a good reason for this that will be explained later. Many industries can cause occupational cadmium exposure since it is utilized in everyday products like rechargeable battery production, plastics production, soldering and welding, and pigment and color production. Whether we like it or not, cadmium is all around us. Here we see some of the audible cadmium tests, reference ranges, and levels that signify excessive exposure. For those of us in the United States, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has set forth regulations that require periodic medical exams for employees that are exposed to cadmium. At the very minimum, there is an initial medical exam yearly for 2 years, then at least every 2 years afterwards. If the employee is exposed to high levels of cadmium for 30 or more days, the employer must provide medical examinations at no cost, including biologics sampling and analysis. This is followed by medical surveillance in which work practice, personal hygiene, respirator usage, if it's required, smoking, hygiene facilities, and engineering controls are evaluated. If there are deficiencies in any category, the employer has to correct them within a 30-day time frame. This leads us to the 4 pollution disasters of Japan, the first and second occurrences of Minamata disease, Yokkaichi asthma, and this presentation, Itai-Itai disease. As a side note, Minamata disease may sound familiar to those that listen to the Toxic History podcast, as it was presented by Dr. Noah Berland in episode 6, the Minamata Bay disaster. If you haven't already done it, check it out. But on to our current subject matter, Itai-Itai disease from cadmium poisoning. First, we'll get the lay of the land of Toyama Prefecture in north-central Japan. It appears to be a very lush area that has the Sea of Japan as its northern border. It has many natural features, including gorges, hot springs, rivers, lakes, mountains, and plains, lots of water sources, and areas for crop growth. To give a more geographical look at where Toyama Prefecture is located, here is an aerial map view. As you can see, Toyama Bay is located right on the Sea of Japan. A portion of the Toyama Prefecture contains several rivers that feed into the Jinzu River, as you see in the middle right there, and eventually out 120 kilometers into Toyama Bay and the Sea of Japan. The Jinzu River Basin provides water to irrigation canals that supplies water to about 20 square kilometers of rice fields in the Toyama Plains. More southward, upstream and inland of the Jinzu River are the Miya and Takahara rivers. One may ask why it's important to know the geographic locations of the rivers. Well, it's primarily due to the location of a large mining area of the Kamioka mine and associated refineries and smelters. The area that is circled in red is approximately 30 kilometers upstream of the rice fields. Notice that the Takahara River is located adjacent to the mining area. Refinery discharge from the mines could potentially end up in the Takahara River, eventually flowing into the Jinzu River. And from the mining perspective, it was reported that a settling pond was constructed to collect industrial discharge, but it was not sufficient. So who owns the mining area? The Kamioka mine was already active in the 17th century prior to its acquisition by the Mitsui clan in 1874. As you can see through the years, there have been multiple affiliations and acquisitions, most notably smelting and refinery plants in 1914 through 1944 in the period shown. The darker area in the lower portion of the map shows the location of the Kamioka mine, which was used to mine silver, copper, and lead. As previously mentioned, this mine was purchased by Mitsui Company, with the surrounding plants acquired by 1889. Zinc mining in particular began in 1905, and improvements in technology allowed for higher yield ore extraction, but at the same time producing finer waste particles. Zinc ore that had been mined had initially been exported for refinery due to a lack of smelting facilities. Refined zinc then had to be imported. In 1914, Omuda Zinc smelting plant began operations in association with the Kamioka mine. Further improvements in the froth flotation process over time provided and improved zinc yields, but the yields also produced, again, more waste product, including cadmium in the tailings and discharge. Zinc production, leading up to 2 world wars, increased due to metal demands. So here's a diagram of a modern-day froth flotation device. The device feeds in a slurry of ore and water that is agitated by a stirrer in the middle. Air is then passed through the stirrer in the middle and creates air bubbles within the slurry. Hydrophobic surfactants are then added, making the surface of the ore hydrophobic. Surfactants can also act as a frother. Air bubbles capture the hydrophobic ore and form a froth, in which stabilizers can be also added to the mix, which prevents the froth from going back into the slurry by increasing the lifetime of the froth. The froth is then skimmed off, collected, and dried to recover the ore. Any impurities are left in the slurry and discharged as tailings. Unfortunately, World War II occurred and skilled miners were drafted, which left a hole in the mining workforce. Unskilled laborers replaced the miners, causing heavy losses in ore yield and increased waste. Cadmium-laden waste was discharged into the Takahara River and flowed into the Jinzu River. As previously mentioned, the Jinzu River Basin feeds into irrigation canals used to produce rice and paddy fields. Keep in mind that the Kamioka mine had been operating since the 17th century, but zinc mining and refining had started in the early 20th century. Heavy metals could have already been deposited into and accumulated in the soil for decades prior to World War II, though mining activity expansion may have accelerated the process. With the increase in mining activity, the local communities surrounding the Jinzu River Basin started noticing a lower crop and fish yield, with an approximate crop loss of 1,000 to 1,500 tons per square kilometer. Crop loss was not the only concerning problem. The river water was also used for everyday activities, including drinking, cooking, washing, and bathing. Here's a timeline in which Itai-Itai disease was discovered and coined. Dr. Noboru Hagino, a physician from a town called Fuchu, coined the disease during a medical conference in 1955. It was here that investigations into the epidemiology and causes of Itai-Itai disease started to occur. And why is it called Itai-Itai disease? Well, Dr. Hagino had just returned home to Fuchu in 1946 from World War II to his family-owned clinic to work as a local physician. Fuchu town, as noted on the map, lies alongside the polluted land. It was here that Dr. Hagino would see patients who complained of bone pain localized to the pelvic girdle and legs. These patients cried out Itai-Itai while in pain, and that loosely translates into it hurts, or ouch, ouch, hence the name Itai-Itai disease. The earliest established cases of Itai-Itai disease were in the 1940s, but could have been as early as the 1910s, again, noting that the Kamioka mine had actively been producing zinc ore for several years prior to 1910. At first, the bone pain was thought to be due to multiple causes, like senile osteomalacia, malnutrition, hard labor, giving birth to multiple children and even menopause. However, Dr. Hagino was uncertain. In 1957, after coining the term Itai-Itai disease, he posited that a heavy metal like zinc could be a causative factor. Dr. Hagino noticed that many Itai-Itai disease cases were centered around the Jinzu River basin. Around a similar time, Kenichi Yoshioka, an agronomist and expert in the science of soil management and crop production, developed Dr. Hagino's heavy metal hypothesis. Yoshioka hypothesized that cadmium was a more likely metal to cause Itai-Itai disease. This was reinforced when Yoshioka found higher cadmium concentrations in crops that were watered by the Jinzu River compared to the other surrounding rivers. It also noted that there were no cases of Itai-Itai disease reported in those living around the Itai River and Kumano River. With cases surrounding the Jinzu River and higher cadmium concentrations in rice and soybean crops grown in the basin, it was likely that cadmium was the primary culprit in Itai-Itai disease. Research into heavy metal contamination began to ramp up, with the national and local governments taking notice. The Ministry of Health and Welfare and Ministry of Education started looking into cadmium as a primary cause, with Kanazawa University leading the epidemiologic investigation. In 1961, the investigations finally yielded some results in that Itai-Itai disease was endemic to the areas surrounding the Jinzu River basin, that victims had renal tubular dysfunction, and that the Jinzu River basin had been contaminated with cadmium stemming from waste discharged by the Kamioka mine. How did this research all happen? Well, Yoshioka had already performed extensive legwork in demonstrating disease locale around the Jinzu River. He had analyzed soil, water, and crops and saw abnormally high cadmium content relative to crops around the Jinzu River basin relative to the other rivers, saw an increase in Itai-Itai disease patients where there was an uptick of zinc ore production at the Kamioka mine, and even found a case of chronic cadmium poisoning in a French medical journal. Dr. Hagino and Yoshioka also enlisted the aid of Professor Jun Kobayashi, an analytical chemist. He developed heavy metal analysis techniques that furthered the research into identifying cadmium as the primary culprit of Itai-Itai disease. Even with the evidence that something was amiss with Itai-Itai disease and the Jinzu River basin, governmental authorities were still a bit skeptical. In 1961, Toyama Prefecture established the Special Committee for Prevention of Local Diseases. This committee surveyed patients suffering from Itai-Itai disease using questionnaires to promote and reinforce the idea that the disease was caused more so by malnutrition rather than mining pollution. And why? Why did they do this? Well, it was likely because the local government had been promoting the Jinzu River Basin as an area of industrialization. Linking a pollution-related disease to the area would cause businesses to be averse to the Jinzu River Basin. The national government went on to establish a pollution department in April of 1964 and was led by Dr. Michio Hashimoto. And that's not the same Dr. Hashimoto of Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Dr. Hashimoto commissioned studies by the Japan Public Health Association, the oldest non-governmental public health entity in Japan, to study Itai-Itai disease. The association gathered groups of researchers, including professors from Kanazawa University, Toyama, and Professor Kobayashi, the aforementioned analytical chemist. The research from this group also showed a correlation between patients that use the Jinzu River water and Itai-Itai disease, and that there was cadmium pollution in the soil around the basin. However, the national government at the time gave an unclear conclusion from the evidence, stating that the disease may be caused by cadmium, but could also be due to other causes. Dr. Hashimoto insisted that the government recognize the scientific evidence from the research groups. And finally, in May of 1968, the government announced that Itai-Itai disease was caused by cadmium poisoning and that the source was Kamioka mine. In the middle of the research that the authorities were conducting, the Itai-Itai Disease Residents Association was formed to obtain relief, obtain clean water, remediate polluted soil, and to clarify the responsibility of Mitsui's mining operation. With the governmental announcement that Itai-Itai disease may be caused by cadmium, a lawsuit was filed against Mitsui for pain and suffering. Many hearings and on-site mine verifications occurred during the trial, and in 1971, June, the plaintiffs won their court case. This case established a causal relationship between Itai-Itai disease and Kamioka mine cadmium discharge based on epidemiologic data. Incidentally, a year prior to this ruling, the Supreme Court of Japan had gathered judges who had been a part of pollution-related lawsuits. This group determined that if the offending company is unable to refute epidemiologic proof, that the court would rule in favor of the plaintiff. After losing the court case, Mitsui appealed to a higher court, which was then subsequently dismissed on August 9th of 1972. The day afterwards, Mitsui and the victims met together, and Mitsui was then admitted that the company was responsible for damages and compensation to the victims, and they were going to remediate contaminated soil. Negotiations began, and they agreed to all of the above. A pollution control agreement was then established. This allowed for facility inspections and improvements to prevent pollution. Tensions ran high during these inspections and meetings. Various measures were demanded of the Kamioka Mine and Mitsui Company. While initially antagonistic, these meetings would soon become friendly after several years as the company became more sympathetic to the victims of Itai-Itai disease. Years of inspections resulted in cooperation between victims and the company, improving mining facilities and reducing pollution outflow. It should be noted that there was a shift in attitude towards environmental consciousness in Japanese society in the late 20th century. Companies that weren't environmentally conscious would not be able to survive. However, Kamioka Mine and the associated facilities around the area was one of very few mines in Japan that was already self-sufficient, but again had become environmentally friendly over time, though it did close in June of 2001. And over time, from 1972 to 2010, cadmium discharge greatly diminished from the mining area. To prevent future pollution in the local agricultural land, cadmium concentrations were limited to 0.1 parts per billion, which was met in 1996. Itai-Itai disease is an example of public participation that led to private and governmental cooperation. It also shows the significance in gathering experts from different disciplines. In this case, it was a physician, Dr. Higino, an agronomist, Dr. Yoshioka, and an analytical chemist, Professor Kobayashi, that helped jumpstart the root cause investigation. There is no accurate number of patients that have suffered from Itai-Itai disease. Epidemiologic surveys were not conducted until 1962, noting that Dr. Higino had begun seeing patients in Fuchu in the 1940s. This could potentially mean that there are undiagnosed patients and victims of Itai-Itai disease. Criteria for Itai-Itai disease was announced with official diagnosis, requiring the listed criteria, including residing in the Jinzu River Basin, non-congenital clinical findings, renal tubular dysfunction, and osteomalacia. As of late 1999, there have been more than 400 patients that have been diagnosed or suspected to have Itai-Itai disease, though again, there's no accurate number of patients. Detection and surveillance is still ongoing, with locals from around the Jinzu River Basin being screened and monitored for Itai-Itai disease to detect and mitigate the process as soon as possible. So chronic cadmium toxicity. In the interest of time, we're going to quickly describe some of the effects that were prominently mentioned in those with Itai-Itai disease and chronic cadmium exposure. As mentioned earlier, cadmium exposure can occur from multiple sources, including inhalation and ingestion. Anywhere between 5 to 20% of cadmium ingested could be absorbed, though the amount absorbed is dependent on whether or not someone is deficient in iron, calcium, or zinc. Once absorbed into blood, cadmium is bound to proteins like albumin and alpha-2 macroglobulin, and distributed to multiple organ systems, including the liver and kidney. In the liver, cadmium complexes with metallothionein and is sequestered away, slowly releasing over time. This complex then circulates into the kidneys, where it is filtered, reabsorbed, and deposited into renal proximal tubular cells. Cadmium then may become a free cation and interfere with cellular processes and generate oxidative stress, cause mitochondrial dysfunction, as well as apoptosis. Renal issues may contribute to altered vitamin D metabolism and can increase urinary calcium and phosphate secretion. Alterations in the aforementioned factors can have negative impact on bone and can be a causative factor in osteomalacia seen in Itai-Itai disease. As with many toxicities, one of the first steps in management for chronic cadmium toxicity treatment is to minimize exposure to further cadmium sources as much as possible and to provide supportive care. Unfortunately, in the context of renal injury, it is largely irreversible. Chelation therapy has been discussed in the literature, but is mostly described in acute cadmium toxicity. The evidence for chelation therapy is unclear for chronic cadmium toxicity. As with many medications, chelators come with risks during administration, in part due to concerns for cadmium mobilization during therapy. Releasing cadmium could cause redistribution into other organ systems and cause other problems. In summary, cadmium is everywhere, but generally safe in background levels. Exposure is likely today due to occupational hazards, but as we saw in Itai-Itai disease, it can also be from environmental exposure. Itai-Itai disease is now recognized thanks in part to persistent multidisciplinary efforts in uncovering the primary cause and fighting for the victims. Lastly, treatment for chronic cadmium toxicity is largely supportive. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for listening in.